Good afternoon, and welcome and thank you for joining us today. Sorry for the short delay that we had. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute based here in Ottawa. It is my great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and very timely discussion on the importance of cooperation between two of the world's most important democracies, Japan and Canada, during this evolving global pandemic, COVID-19. First of all, I'd like to thank both of our guests today, Ambassador Kawamura and Professor Welch, who are good friends of mine and two of the strongest proponents of the Japan-Canada relationship that you will find. Through your stewardship, I'm confident that this relationship will continue to reach new heights. Indeed, Canada and Japan have long been key international partners, both bilaterally and multilaterally. The two countries are vibrant democracies that support trade, investment, and the rules-based international order. Their cooperation internationally spans a range of bodies, including the G7, the G20, APEC, and so many more. The two sides are now also committed to enhancing high-ambition trade relations through the TPP-11. The COVID-19 crisis has provided a moment of clarity for many countries, including Japan and Canada, on the importance of enhancing that cooperation. In my view, it is crucial going forward that Japan and Canada continue to work in tandem and also alongside other allies to reinforce secure supply chains, protect our international institutions, and work even more closely to sustain a rules-based order that continues to be under siege by revisionist forces and fragmented global unity. So with that said, let me briefly introduce today's participants. First, we have Ambassador Kawamura. Ambassador Kawamura Yasuhisa has served as Ambassador of Japan to Canada since November 2019. Before being posted to Canada, he was Ambassador Deputy Representative of Japan to the United Nations between 2017 and 2019. He previously served as Press Secretary, Director General for Press and Public Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs between 2015 and 2017. In addition, Ambassador Kawamura has served in so many posts in the Japanese Foreign Service abroad, including in missions in India, New York City, Indonesia, and the European Union. Next, we have Professor David Welch. David Welch is the Center for International Governance Innovation Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow at CIGI, where he has been working for several years on Asia-Pacific security issues. David Welch received his PhD from Harvard University, and I believe he was studying under Joseph Nye, if I'm correct. He's published many books, monographs, and articles on Japan, East Asian security, is a good friend, and has been a prolific and active participant in Japan-Canada security issues for several years. So with that, I'll lead off with the Ambassador. Ambassador, please, you have the floor, and you have 10 to 15 minutes to tell us about the Japanese side. I'm sorry, Ambassador, you're just on mute.
Apology for my stupid cutting off the microphone. Sorry about that. First of all, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your kind introduction and your invitation to today's webinar on the imminent issue of COVID-19 and it's posing strategic questions for both of us, Japan and Canada. And it's so nice to meet with you, Professor Welch. I was looking forward to meeting and discussing with you on this webinar opportunity. So let me first start with my opening remarks about how Japan sees the current challenge posed by COVID-19 and how Japan and Canada have been and should be and will be meeting those both challenges. It has been almost 10 months since we heard the word COVID-19 for the first time. We have been fighting against the virus. Its merciless attack continues. Countries are in the midst of the even harsher second wave. Japan tided over the past infection peaks in April, due mainly to people's voluntary responses to the government's call for stay home. We did the same thing as the Canadians did. We had the recent infection peak in August, and we are currently standing on a delicate balance of increasing and decreasing of new infections. Our daily new infections are between 400 and 600 nationwide. We are in belief that there's no quick fix or silver bullet for the time being until ultimate weapons of vaccines and authentic medicines become substantially available for the people. Japan is currently in quest for the best policy mix by harnessing the wisdom of public and private sectors alike. We're at the stage of revitalizing socioeconomic activities while maintaining preventive measures. We're on the same boat with the Canadians as well. We are doing utmost by increasing testing capacity, practicing social distancing, intensive tracing of hotspots or the virus, and listening to health guidelines and following sanitary measures and wearing masks. COVID-19 brought the world division and further accelerated the pace of unilateralism, which we had seen even before the outbreak. While each country focused on its COVID outbreak within its border, a rule-based international order has been attacked more than ever. However, we should not give in to such challenges to scatter the world. Rather, we should make the world use this unprecedented challenge to strengthen our unity around the rule-based international order and multilateralism. No country would become safer and healthier while the rest of the world is struggling for survival from the virus. Japan and Canada have much in common: parliamentary democracy, market economy, responsible members of G7 and G20, and commitment to develop universal healthcare and public health priority in their policy goals. Japan would like to sail on the boat of multilateralism and the rule of law together with Canada and other like-minded countries in order to fight back against the challenges COVID-19 has posed to the world. Now, let me speak about Japan's thoughts and means to meet such global challenges. Firstly, we recognize the spread of the coronavirus is a human security crisis, posing threat to lives, livelihood, and dignity of people around the globe. Our new Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, made clear in his first policy speech at the Diet last week by saying COVID-19 threatening human security, which requires international cooperation. Japan will continue to support developing countries and will promote multilateralism. But multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, WHO, and WTO require reforms. Japan will engage itself with such an effort. On the basis of human security, we are making proactive international efforts with focus of three perspectives. First, Japan will continue to support the development of therapeutics, vaccines, as well as diagnostics, while we also work to ensure fair and equitable access to the vaccines for all through GAVI, CEPI, and COVAX facility. At GAVI's third donor pledging conference held in last June, Japan announced its financial commitment to GAVI, including for the COVAX Advanced Market Committee, so as to enable fair and equitable access to vaccines for lower-income countries. Secondly, Japan has been supporting developing countries to strengthen their health systems in order to prepare for future health crises. Take Africa, for example. Japan assisted the establishment of Noguchi Memorial Institute in Ghana. Now the institute serves as the hub of the country's response to the coronavirus and processes up to 80% of PCR tests carried out in Ghana. Thirdly, Japan supports the international efforts to ensure health security in an even broader context. We made efforts to improve the conditions of water, sanitation, hygiene, and nutrition in developing countries, as they are important prerequisites for health security. In addition to the direct support to the response to COVID-19, we should not forget the importance of the multilateral organs, such as the United Nations and WHO, where all stakeholders engage constructively to respond to crises and work with transparency. Prime Minister Suga, in his recent United Nations General Assembly address, said the UN is in need of neutral and fair governance more than ever. WHO is also critically important in this context, and it will be able to make even better use of necessary expertise at the right time and in the right manner through its review and reform. Japan is ready to cooperate in the review and reform process of the WHO, which is key for the collective response to the infectious diseases. In the economy, it is important to strengthen free trade, which has been hit hard by COVID. Reform of the WTO is a must. Japan argues that special measures in trade, which were introduced in response to COVID-19, should be transparent and temporary, and that they should be in alignment with the WTO treaties. Measures which would distort world trade should be canceled as early as possible, and facilitating trade and investment is needed in order to strengthen supply chains. Japan and Canada share many common values, including promotion of the rule-based international order in the areas including security and the economy. In the fight against the COVID-19, the two countries are key contributors in the development of a vaccine, the realization of fair access to a vaccine for developing countries, and the promotion of free trade in various multilateral platforms, including GAVI and COVAX facility. The two countries have emphasized the importance of multilateralism and strengthened their cooperation in high level, including between Prime Minister Suga and Prime Minister Trudeau, and between Foreign Minister Motegi and Foreign Minister Champagne. In the summit telephone talk between our two prime ministers, they confirmed their cooperation, in the fight against COVID-19, as well as the promotion of the rule-based international order. They particularly reconfirmed their continued cooperation towards the realization of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Our two countries cooperate in academic research as well. Universities and research institutes in Japan proactively utilize computing resources and technology in the fight against COVID. Japan's supercomputer Fugaku. Fugaku is the name of the supercomputer, which means Mount Fuji, the highest peak, is the symbol of the word. Fugaku is also expected to be used jointly by research institutes in Japan and Canada in the future. Fugaku is a supercomputer jointly developed by Riken Institute and Fujitsu in Japan. In September, it was ranked #1 in the top 500 fastest supercomputer systems in the world. I want to get off the subject a little bit here because I'm personally glad that the Japan supercomputers maintain their competitiveness edge even after 30 years of Japan and the US had a tough negotiation over supercomputers manufacturing and procurement policy. Both sides, I remember, talked around the clock in order to avoid the imposition of unilateral trade sanctions. But those were good old days, or just old days. Soon after them, the new normal, namely the brand new WTO, which was installed with progressed dispute settlement mechanisms, was established. It was a welcome news for every one of the world traders. There's no question about the role that WTO has played in the succeeding years for the sound development of world trade. In the private sector level cooperation between two countries, I want to introduce Montreal-based pharmaceutical company Medicago, which is an affiliated company in Canada of Japanese pharmaceutical company Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharm Corporation, is developing a made in Canada COVID-19 vaccine candidate and started the first clinical trial in Canada in July. On top of that, on October 23rd, Prime Minister Trudeau announced the federal government would purchase 76 million doses of Medicago's vaccine and provide financial support of 173 million Canadian dollars to Medicago. According to Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma, Medicago will develop a VLP vaccine. VLP stands for plant-derived virus-like. VLP vaccine. And VLP vaccine is expected to be promising vaccine technology with safety since VLP does not have genetic information and viruses do not multiply in the body. Medicago is conducting clinical studies of the VLP vaccine, and phase 1 is nearing completion. Phase 2 trials will be started in November next month, and phase 3 trials will begin in December to evaluate the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. Another company, Halifax-based Apili Therapeutics, has been conducting clinical trials of Avigan, an anti-COVID drug developed by Fujifilm Chemical in Japan, by receiving their support. Fujifilm applied for approval of Avigan as a COVID-19 treatment in Japan on October the 16th. Well, to sum up, I have spoken too long. We would like to make this unprecedented world crisis a chance to further deepen bilateral relations through which Japan and Canada can accomplish more for the rest of the world. Tough time brings opportunity. We should not miss this opportunity. Thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kawamura, for that very excellent speech. And I think you covered so many interesting areas, both where Canada and Japan are working bilaterally, multilaterally, and also where they could be working in the future, which I think is very important. And I hope we get to some more of those themes in the question period. So thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Dr. David Welch to give us some insights from the Canadian side. David, it's your turn to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for the invitation to join you today, and thanks to the ambassador for that excellent overview. I think he spared a lot of us a lot of time and trouble trying to get the picture right before we dive into the details. I just want to start by prefacing my remarks with a comment that current events make experts of everybody quickly. At least we often tend to think that it makes experts of everybody. I'm not a health security expert. I am not an epidemiologist. I do study global governance, and of course, health security is an important issue in global governance. But like many people during this COVID pandemic, I've had to learn a lot very quickly. And the more you learn about something, the more you realize how little you actually know. So I just want to preface my remarks by saying what I have to offer is the perspective of somebody who's very interested in knowing more, understanding more, but also very conscious of the limitations of my knowledge. That said, there are a couple of lessons I think that probably can safely be drawn from the COVID experience. And one of those lessons is that it takes a combination of levels of governance to deal with this kind of outbreak. You can't go it alone. You can't just localize the management of an issue like this. You need to more or less seamlessly integrate global health governance, transmission of knowledge and insight and data. National governments have to be able to mobilize the resources that they can mobilize according to their constitutional arrangements. Provincial or state governments and federal systems, often key players, certainly in Canada. A lot of the actual management of the COVID crisis has fallen on the laps of the provinces. And even down to the level of municipalities. The United States is sort of the textbook case of how not to manage a pandemic. But if you look at where it's been managed well, a lot of the action, as far as I can tell, has been at the municipal level. So, mayors of cities have either performed really well or really poorly in the absence of a larger national coordinated response strategy. So you need all of these things. A second thing that seems to me interesting and important is that despite the enormous variation in countries' experiences of COVID-19, that variation in and of itself is a source of relevant information and a source of knowledge. So this is a new virus. We had to learn a lot about its transmission patterns. We had to learn a lot about its virulence. We had to learn about its morbidity. We learned that only slowly through the process of suffering. But the basic science was there, and we had some prior experience with pandemics in many parts of the world, and including Canada. Canada was, in a sense, lucky to have had the SARS experience several years ago. That didn't mean we had to spool up from ground zero and try to mobilize a response to this particular virus. That's all been very, very helpful. The patterns are interestingly different. In Canada's case, I would say, probably the main challenge in our case has been federalism. Different provinces have responded well or ill. It's almost miraculous that in Atlantic Canada, there have been so few cases and so few deaths. You move just a little bit west to Quebec, and Quebec compares unfavorably to almost every OECD country in terms of caseload and case mortality. Ontario does a little bit better than Quebec. British Columbia was doing great for a long time, and now it's facing an upsurge in cases. So the federal structure of Canada has been one of those key challenges. Some countries have managed it extremely well, and those are the ones that would be really nice to look to and learn from. And I'm thinking particularly of New Zealand. I'm thinking of Taiwan, countries that managed to actually crack down early, maintain the proper protocols, the distancing, cut off infections coming into their countries, doing a terrific job of tracking and tracing and mobilizing tests. If we all had done that early, the world would be a much better place right now. Tragically, Canada basically folded up its distant early warning unit whose job was to spot over the horizon pandemic type threats. Tragic mistake. I think if that had not been done, we would have been able to anticipate this earlier and respond to it better. But in the grand scheme of things, I would say that Canada's actually done very well, considering we share the world's longest undefended border, with the country that's actually performed poorest, in my opinion, on managing the COVID crisis. And shutting down that border was a remarkable feat, and from a public health perspective, a pretty effective one. Obviously, there are economic consequences, but the economic consequences haven't been as bad as some people feared. So stepping back, what does that mean for Japan and Canada? I mean, it means a few things, and the ambassador has already flagged some of these. Canada and Japan have both had good stories and not so good stories about their response to the coronavirus. I would say Japan has done much better. Japan has quite miraculously got relatively low new daily caseloads in what is the beginning of, I believe, Japan's third wave. The idea that Tokyo would only have 200 or 300 new cases a day when the trains and subways are still full in the morning and in evening rush hour strikes me as astonishing. So Japan is doing something that I think Canada could learn from. Canada has also responded well in some places, as I've said, and there are probably some lessons there for Japan as well. But the big challenge to my mind is how to navigate this global pandemic when you have essentially no official cooperation from the United States, a traditional world leader in this kind of thing, at least an administration that is doing its best to run interference for the Centers for Disease Control and some of the United States' best globally connected health units. And from China, which clearly did not share information early on the virus and attempted to downplay it. And there's no question that the Chinese regime prioritized its own survival politically, domestically, against the interests of the world in combating a pandemic that had its source in China, as far as we can tell. World Health Organization still functioning, I would say, quite well. but it's had difficulty because of the China angle. And one of the big challenges now is trying to get that good quality information out of China's early experience. And then also China's objections to Taiwan participating in global health forums when Taiwan has so much to offer the rest of the world in a case study of how to manage a crisis of this kind. So I think there are things Canada and Japan can do together bilaterally, but I think the real takeaway here is that Canada, Japan, and other like-minded countries who are similarly situated and have very strong shared interests, and I'm thinking, for example, of not only Taiwan, but New Zealand, Germany, and so on. I think it's time for us to have a coalition of the willing step up and try to extract the global health governance problem from the geopolitical challenges that the Chinese-American rivalry bring at the moment, and that internal Chinese politics also bring at the moment. So those are sort of general thoughts I would have. Not sure how these translate into specific policies, but I'll stop there and we'll have a broader discussion.
Well, thanks very much, David. Thought-provoking as always, and I think there's a lot to tease out there from both some of the themes that you raised and also those that Ambassador Kawamura raised earlier. So I think at this point I'm going to abuse the position of the moderator here and ask a few kind of introduction questions, and then towards the end of this webinar, I'd like to solicit some questions from the audience. We've already had some interesting questions, and then we can get into those. So to open up, and I think this kind of touches on some of the themes that both of you have addressed already in your presentations. My first sort of question, I think, is under that broad basket of international institutions and the future of international institutions, both dealing with COVID and more broadly. So the pandemic has magnified some of the challenges and vulnerabilities within the international system, I think as both of you have referenced. There has been a somewhat erratic and uncoordinated global response to the coronavirus pandemic. Rather than working together in international fora, it seems that many countries have rather turned inwards for their own domestic solutions rather than an internationalist approach. There also, in tandem with this, has been some disenchantment from many about how key international institutions are dealing with this. And I think some reference already the World Health Organization, but I think another one to add to that mix would be the G20. A question to both of you, and I'll ask David to answer this question first and then Ambassador after. So how would you grade the internationalist response so far to COVID-19? And from a Japan-Canada lens, how do you think Japan and Canada could play a role to further its effectiveness?
Well, I don't think there's been much thoughtful collaboration internationally on this pandemic response for a few reasons. The G7, I think, is actually extremely well placed to tackle this kind of challenge and coordinate responses among some of the world's wealthiest and most powerful countries. But there's a spoiler in the G7, and it's the United States. And that's the first time that that's been true ever. So I think the G7 could have done a better job if it had a more internationalist-minded American administration at the table. The G20, I think it's a valuable thing. I'm always in favor of countries having an opportunity to get together and talk about a range of issues collectively in a relatively focused way. But honestly, the G20 has never really lived up to its billing except during the 2008 financial crisis. It's just too big. It's too unwieldy. There's not enough sense of common purpose in it. And there are several spoilers in the G20. So it's not an organization I would personally turn to try to help manage this.
Excellent. Thanks for that, David. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I do not want to do some multi-forum shopping. In order to deal effectively with this immense and imminent challenge of COVID-19, I think the first and foremost, we would like to first think of the role of multilateral institutions function. And so we will take the WHO, for example. As I said in the first statement, WHO is key in a collective response to infectious diseases, not limited to COVID-19, but there may be other new infectious diseases coming up. So through its review and reform,
Ambassador, I think it seems like we might have just missed your last point there. But maybe we'll kind of continue on to the second question, and maybe you can dovetail some of your answer into that once your video comes back. Kind of my second question, which is related to this, is on the global economy. So I think both of you made very interesting points on international institutions. With regard to how the global economy has been dealt with internationally and multilaterally through this pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis has also provided this moment of clarity, as I mentioned, with countries such as Canada and Japan, looking to work more closely with like-minded countries to secure and reinforce their supply chains. Indeed, the lockdowns around the world have revealed important weaknesses in the supply chains of many countries. And we've seen this in Canada on PPE and other issues in securing that. Is there, David, I think, kind of outlined this point a little bit in his comments about how the G20 really only showed its effectiveness in 2008, 2009 during the financial crisis. Is there still hope for a...
Live streaming is on.
So again, on the economy, is there still hope for both a multilateral solution to some of these problems? And I think what both the ambassador and David have been hinting at, is there a complementary piece to this? So is there whether we call it minilateral or plurilateral, is there a complementary piece to this cooperation on the economic side? And what shape might that look like? Is this a D10 model? Or is this the G7 as some have framed? So, on that, maybe, David, I'll ask you first while we're waiting for the ambassador to come back. Sorry, David, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I guess I would say that the crisis has provided an opportunity for companies particularly to think more clearly about their supply chain security, to map their supply chains. A lot of companies aren't even aware of their complete supply chain down 2 or 3 levels, more than 2 to 3 levels below the end product. Will be some initiative, I think, at least in critical industrial sectors, things like PPE and medical equipment, to bring production back home, so that at least you can have some capacity domestically, even if international trade is severely disrupted. But most economists that I read don't think there'll be a major long-term effect from the pandemic. In other words, the world is so completely globalized that it'll be marginal adjustments for marginal kinds of goods and services. And that what we really should do is not try to fundamentally change the structure of the global economic order, but improve it on the margins when we have the opportunity. And one opportunity is the fact that we have the CPTPP, of which Canada and Japan are both members. And it's a great natural group of like-minded countries who, for the most part, have done quite well in managing this pandemic. And so that's one vehicle, I think, that the member countries could use to try to bring their supply chains more within the grouping. I would like to see Taiwan brought on board the CPTPP. I think that would be a plus for the group as well as for Taiwan. But the larger issues that plague the WTO, those aren't going to get fixed anytime soon, and they're not going to get fixed because of the pandemic, in my opinion.
That's great, David. Thank you. And if I could just get a quick follow-up onto that response. One thing that was floated, as you said, there's been a lot of chaos the past year in the way some of these multilateral groupings have been organized. But one of the things that was floated by the US and by the Trump administration while I was hosting G7 was the idea of expanding the G7. Obviously, Russia was named as one of the potential people becoming one of the states that are becoming back into the G7. I don't think that was warmly thought of by anyone really in that grouping, but I think there was an important thought on India, Australia, and South Korea. So, do you think whether it's an expanded G7 or whether this is a D10, a democracy 10 grouping, do you think there's validity in kind of expanding these sort of current institutions to be a bit more representative?
Well, that was the idea behind the G20, right? It was supposed to be a more representative version of the G7. And, if the G20 had a track record of success on major issues, taking the front role in major issues, then I think that would have been a good argument for that approach. The G7 has the advantage of a manageable number. And for the most part, these are very like-minded countries. So when they decide to act in concert, they can do it more effectively. I don't know that you need to expand the G7. You can always bring additional countries in as dialogue partners and as observers. And of course, India would be a natural candidate to be brought into certain G7 discussions, even if not as a full member.
Excellent. Okay. Ambassador, have you been able to rejoin us? Just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on this issue of the economic challenges by COVID and how multilateral institutions might be able to respond.
Actually, sorry for the trouble, technical trouble. But I can sum it up. My thoughts is that as far as the international organizations are concerned, just remember the 75 years ago or 70 years ago, when first we designed the international institutions, such as the United Nations, WHO or WTO, GATS or whatever. We designed the international organs. We are the architects, and we built it and used them for over 7 decades or so. They are full of a series of fantastic achievements, like elimination polio, smallpox, and the reduction of the world poverty by 50%. All those glorious achievements were possible under the leadership and the cooperation of the member states. So we need to underline the historic role to be played by the international organizations. And if there may be any problems, then it is our responsibility to remedy any flaws there may be in them. So if the WHO has a lot of challenges, especially in the initial stage, as you two described today's seminar, but it's a challenge. And so we need to listen to every comments and claims from the all sources and the member countries, and we look very much forward to doing some necessary process and reform if need be. Then we will continue to expect those international organizations such as the WHO to play the role to meet the challenges. Without the WHO, I think, as I said before, the fair and equitable access of vaccines to the developing countries will not be correctly managed. So I think that we could encourage them to change according to those challenges and then reform itself if necessary. That's the only possible way for our international community to deal with these imminent challenges.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ambassador. I would agree with a lot of your insights, and I think that while there has been a lot of these institutions have faced challenges in recent months, I think the key is to reform and not necessarily do away with, and think of creative solutions that we can complement these international institutions as they deal with these challenges. So my last sort of question before sending us off for audience questions, and this would be more on the geopolitical and security side, and I'll have the ambassador answer first, and then David. So rather than distracting states from conflict or coercive behavior, it seems in many ways that the pandemic has actually accelerated, in many cases, the geostrategic risk around the world. We have seen, for example, bolder state interventions and activities from the Caucasus to the Galwan Valley, the Taiwan Strait, and closer to home for Japan, around Japan's Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Many of these tripwires are in Japan's backyard. Has this disorder been furthered by the pandemic and its response? And does this show again why there needs to be more Canada-Japan strategic cooperation in the security space? So I'll let the ambassador deal with this first, and then David afterwards. Ambassador? Sorry, I think you're on mute. Okay, David, did you want to jump in first, and then maybe the ambassador can join us afterwards? You're on mute as well, David, sorry.
Can you hear me?
So much.
Okay, yes, ambassador, let's go with you first then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. To your question that the role of Japan and Canada in the context of COVID-19 and Indo-Pacific peace and stability. Yes, exactly. We have more role to play. Under the new normal brought by COVID-19 and the recent dramatic developments in the region, Japan and Canada will need more engagements, more necessary than ever. Over the last 10 months, we have probably witnessed a wide range of irresponsible conducts, particularly in this region, in the Indo-Pacific region. Canada now must deal with the tenser and more unpredictable Indo-Pacific as compared to even 6 months ago, on top of a variety of issues, including territorial disputes, unilateral actions that challenge the norms of the rule-based international order. Under the COVID-19, as we build back and newly build our economies, it is critical to ask ourselves what kind of international order we need to restore and create in the Indo-Pacific region and elsewhere. It is obvious that we need to strengthen rule of law, especially in the area of maritime security. We need to have more resilient and diversified supply chains and rule-based multilateral trade system that is transparent and fair. I think I have explained the main points of the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Among the principles of Japan's approach to FOIP, it is like a common banner under which we stand for freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights as foundations for peace and stability in the region. There's also need for high-quality infrastructure for inclusive growth that leaves no one behind, reliable and transparent supply chain of PPEs, personal protective equipments, and other essential goods, especially under the COVID-19 attacks. The worrying tendencies, especially on the sea, requires that the capacity building assistance measures in maritime law enforcement is the focus of Japan together with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation. Prime Minister Suga recently visited Vietnam and Indonesia for his first overseas visit. Vietnam is the current chair of the ASEAN, and Indonesia is, of course, the largest economy in ASEAN. So he visited those two countries and confirmed Japan's position regarding the free and open Indo-Pacific. He welcomed and agreed that ASEAN's FOIP, so-called AOIP, has a lot of in common in those fundamental elements which we find in the FOIP. So we agreed and then agreed to promote the cooperations in this regard. The bottom line of this agreement is that we'll continue to engage ourselves with the like-minded friends in Asia, Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region to preserve the common values, namely the rule of law, democracy, and so on, so that the dynamo of the global economy in the Pacific Ocean area will continue to prosper and be stable. So that's the very important goal of our joint work. And when coming to Canada, it is obvious that Canada is one of the major players in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific countries hold the key to the future of the world. And Canada is respected as a country of principle for its endeavors to uphold diversity. Canada, they call it middle power. Canada as middle power with global perspective, with plenty of glorious and innovative diplomatic history. It is amazing. So Canada has a role to play in realizing a free and open Indo-Pacific together with Japan and other like-minded countries.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. David, did you have anything very brief to add on to that, or did you want to go to the questions?
Just briefly, I'd like to thank the ambassador for those very kind words about Canada. I would have agreed with him 15, 20 years ago. I think Canada's been punching below its weight in the region recently, and I think it's a very good time for Canada to go back to its more broad-based, energetic engagement. So three cheers for that. I'm on record actually arguing that Canada and Japan should be thinking seriously about bolstering their security cooperation right up to the level of alliance. And so anyone who wants to read my argument about that, it's available in International Journal last year. Yeah, in the interest of time, I think I'll just leave that at that.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I think it's time now we can move on to some audience questions. We have a lot of very good ones. The first one that I'd like to get to very closely follows on to the point that we just had. And, I don't want to risk duplication of some of the great remarks that both of you have just made, but I think this issue is so important. And I'm just going to tweak this question just a little bit with an extra add-on. So Eleanor has asked, has Japan's approach to a free and open Indo-Pacific changed under the new Prime Minister Suga? I think that the ambassador has referenced a bit of this already, but maybe if we could address this point a little bit more. And my sort of add-on to that question will be, and where does Canada fit into this free and open Indo-Pacific? I know there's been discussion in both of your remarks on that, but should Canada develop its own free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, approach, outlook? Where precisely, even if you list 2 or 3 things, could Canada contribute in this FOIP context? So I'll start with the ambassador, please. Ambassador, could you please unmute yourself? Okay, well, maybe we'll, while we're waiting for the ambassador on that question, we'll kind of move on to another one. And we'll come back to the free and open Indo-Pacific. But this was one I think that can be kind of dovetailed into that, is a bit separate, but is focused in particular on foreign interference. So Helen has asked, how can a stronger alliance or partnership between Canada and Japan successfully counter foreign interference in their respective countries. So, David, do you mind going first on this one?
Sure. I think there's a lot of information sharing to be done. I think that is at multiple levels. I think it's in terms of policing, it's in terms of domestic and security intelligence, and it's in terms of foreign intelligence. One of the big challenges will be trying to make sure that Canada and Japan are on the same page when it comes, for example, to having Chinese equipment in the 5G infrastructure, and whether Huawei in particular will be allowed to participate in the Canadian 5G network. That decision is still on hold. My guess is that decision has been made, but just not announced, and Huawei will not be welcome, but it probably will await the resolution of the Meng Wanzhou extradition case before the Canadian government wants to throw that particular issue on fire of Canada-Chinese relations. But it's a lot that can be done and should be done, and all democracies should be jealous of their domestic sovereignty and cooperative in protecting it.
Thanks a lot. Ambassador, do we have you on? How about the question on Japan's approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific under the new Prime Minister Suga and Canada's potential role? I'm grateful for your thoughts.
All right. For it, Japan and the ASEAN, Indonesia and Vietnam. But in Prime Minister Suga's visit to those two countries, they have reconfirmed the value.
Sorry, Ambassador. I think we seem to have kind of lost you for a moment. Let's quickly move on. David, I just had a quick follow-up to your last point on foreign interference, and I think this is a question that I think I've many times been posed in Tokyo and elsewhere when talking about Japanese security issues and Canada and Japan on security. Is there a role for Japan in the Five Eyes construct? Whether this is officially as a Six Eye or whether this is more from an ad hoc perspective, should we be more concretely about Japan in this Five Eyes context? So, David, if you could address that first.
So, in principle, yes. I mean, Japan is a member of what for better word we would just call the North Atlantic Security Community, and it should be a full security partner. There are technical challenges to having Japan join Five Eyes, and it has to do with domestic communications legislation. It has to do with infrastructure to some extent. Language represents a bit of a challenge, full integration to Five Eyes. So these things would have to be worked out. I honestly couldn't tell you how challenging the technicalities are, but I'm sure there's a lot of goodwill when it comes to intelligence sharing. It's not that anybody really wants to exclude Japan.
Thank you. Ambassador, if I could get some of your thoughts. So maybe bundling a couple of these questions that we've already handled. One is on foreign interference. So is there a role for Canada and Japan to cooperate to counter foreign interference? And the last question I just asked David on top of that was, when looking at the Five Eyes, is there a role for Japan to play in the construct of the Five Eyes? Doesn't necessarily mean it will become a Six Eye, but is this an organization that Japan should become, much more involved in?
For the last question you mentioned, Five Eyes or Six Eyes or Seven Eyes, whatever. But the reality of interactions between our G7 partners and like-minded countries, those include the members of the Five Eyes, so to speak. But the reality of our interactions daily of conduct is so close and frequent. So we'll continue to tackle the issues of the time and imminent challenges from whatever the sources very effectively. So we'll continue to cherish this working relationship among those like-minded countries and allies. So whatever the issues, whatever the challenges may come up. For interference question, I think the answer is in nature the same. When it coming to Japan and Canada, we have common fundamental values. So our communications and channels between the two top leaders are so close and so frequent. So for any issues to come up, we can flexibly respond to those challenges in a very effective way. So there's no quick fix to those questions, but fundamentally we are so relaxed and positive, optimistic about the future working relationship between Japan and Canada.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ambassador. So the next question we have, and this is a question, and I think I'll go to David first on this one. So this comes from Minako, and getting away a little bit from the geopolitics and security for a moment, Minako asks about whether cultural differences between Japan and Canada can help explain different approaches to combating COVID-19 pandemic. And on a cultural level, what can Canadians learn from the Japanese and vice versa when it comes to managing pandemics? And I think this can transcend the issue of the pandemic as well. I know David has done a lot of good work on this. So David, let's have your insights on this question.
Yeah, great question. Two big things. One is mask wearing. It's taken a while, but the Canadians are finally getting up to the Japanese level of comfort wearing masks in public. And the other is not shaking hands. I think we should embrace the Japanese bow as a greeting. I always thought that was more hygienic. So with luck, the COVID-19 pandemic will kill off the handshake as a rather bizarre, out-of-date greeting ritual in the West and much of the rest of the world. So those are the two things I would flag.
That's great. Ambassador, is there some thoughts that you might have on this question?
Okay. Yes, I'm not a scientist, so I refrain from giving an answer whether shaking hands is a part of the question. But my sense, since I have been here for almost a year, there may be some differences between Japan and Canada, where culture plays a certain role, especially in the COVID-19 context. The masks are always the discussions. But as Professor Welch said, nowadays wearing masks is a part of the Canadian culture these days. And again, on the point of COVID-19, there's no silver bullet to cope with this challenge. The bottom line, in my eyes, would be to learn from each other the good practices, share the expertise, and try to find the best way to deal with it, best policy mix, and with the spirit of unity. But I was impressed with the Canadian people's receptive, flexible receptiveness. Take an example of masks. In the initial stage of the pandemic, people do have some debate over whether the masks have preventive power or not. But nowadays, the recommendation by the health experts, they accepted it. It has become now a part of their daily life. So I admire the Canadian people's very flexible and sincere and approach to deal with this health challenge. We need to learn from each other, from those daily behaviors and a basic sense of the approach to the health issue. It's quite worthwhile for learning.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ambassador. And I would agree. I mean, I think both of you referenced a bit of the mask culture, and anyone who's spent a significant amount of time in Japan as a foreigner, I noticed once I started going back on my business flights back to Japan, I would always wear a mask on the airplane. And at that time, I was one of the few Westerners wearing a mask. But I guarantee now, if there was full flights to Tokyo, and eventually, hopefully, we do get back to that time in the coming months, I won't be the only one wearing a mask. So I think that both sides are learning from each other on the pandemic. So one additional question that we have here, and again, a very interesting, very specific question, but one of importance, I think. Meg has asked, will Canada and Japan bilateral science and technology agreement that they both have, will this assist at all, or what role will this play in the co-management of issues related to this pandemic? So I have to plead ignorance that I myself don't know a whole lot about this specific agreement, but as good scholars of the Canada-Japan relationship, I'm sure the ambassador and David are much more up on this than I am. So maybe the ambassador, if you don't mind going first on this.
Okay, as far as I know, under the existing treaty or cooperation agreement in science and technology between our two countries, there's no specific agenda for two countries to pursue in the context of COVID-19 or pandemic prevention. But rather, in the context of the health management and AI, on those issues are the main major hopeful targets for the Japanese corporations, Japan and Canada corporations, by using the health and AI technologies among the private sectors and the research institutes will continue to cooperate further in the coming months.
Excellent. David, did you have anything to add on that? Don't feel you need to.
I know the agreement is basically a statement of principles and a statement of willingness to facilitate cooperation. So it doesn't direct anything in particular. It doesn't prevent anything in particular, but it's an attempt to encourage greater science and technology collaboration. And by the way, it's an old agreement. It's 1986, and it was signed by Prime Minister Abe's father on behalf of Japan. It's one of a number Canada has with several countries around the world. And in the Far East, also, we have agreements with South Korea and with China. Very similar agreements.
Well, excellent. I think it's an example of the broad strokes of how deep this relationship is on a wide range of issues. We've talked about security a bit here, but this on science and technology, this is just another area of where the two cooperate on. So I think for my last question, and this is a great one, I believe we have from Kimi Hara, and this in many ways is the elephant in the room that I think we've kind of been discussing through, whether it's through institutions, through the economy, or through geopolitics. And Hara Sensei asks, while U.S.-China strategic tensions continue to grow amid the pandemic, in which ways can Canada and Japan continue to work together to avoid this escalation of tensions, and how will they kind of continue to work together on a strategic partnership amidst U.S.-China strategic competition? So maybe let's go, David, if you don't mind going first, and then the ambassador, you can conclude.
Sure. Well, I would say it's very important to avoid escalation of unnecessary tensions. And there are cases where there are high levels of tension that, in my opinion, aren't really warranted by the facts on the ground. I think the South China Sea is the strongest example of that. I realize that my reading of the South China Sea situation is different from most people's, but I honestly, truly do think, based looking very carefully at the evidence and talking to people who are well positioned to know, that China is not behaving anywhere near as nefariously in the South China Sea as most of us think. On the other hand, there are issues where further escalation of tensions may well be warranted. Crackdown on Hong Kong, human rights situation in Xinjiang, possible Chinese military operations against Taiwan. These things could all potentially increase tensions with China. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have strong positions on these issues. I think we should, in concert with like-minded countries. We have to be faithful to our principles because that's who we are, even if it does risk an escalation in tensions.
Okay, thank you, David. Ambassador, your thoughts? Sorry, you're just on mute still.
Oh.
There you go.
Yeah. Sorry. it's supposed to be the cutting edge technology, but it doesn't look like so today, especially. Okay, in the South China Sea and this area, well, I think the Prime Minister Suga mentioned during his recent trip to Vietnam and Indonesia. He also touched upon the issue of FOIP, but at the same time, the issue of tensions in the South China Sea. He opposed to any actions or behavior which might end up increasing the tensions in the area. And he also touched upon the bottom line of Japanese policy of keeping the regional peace and stability in the region. That is the application of the rule of law, and dispute must be resolved through peaceful means based upon the international law. So that was the basis, fundamental basic thoughts that Japan has. And it was launched in 2014 in the Singapore. But so those the principles to deal with the disputes involving the maritime oceans and the territories, I think the peaceful resolution, rule-based argument, that is the most important element. So we'd like to underline again that to deal with the current imminent situations, we also get back to the very basic of code of conduct, the rule-based, and the peaceful means to settle disputes. That's quite important. On top of that, the countries like Japan and Canada and like other like-minded countries who believes in the value of the rule-based international order should work together and cooperate and show the unity in this regard.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. And I think that's a good way to end. I mean, if you think about it, there's two important points that I think that both of you highlighted. And of course, if many of us maybe want to pretend that pull the kind of bed sheets over and pretend that we're not here. But next week we have an election coming up, as I think a lot of people know, down in the United States. And I think of many of the issues that people are focused on in foreign policy will be the U.S.-China relationship. I think one of the important points, at least from my perspective, is I don't think that necessarily structurally will change from that election, whether the Biden administration gets elected or whether we have another 4 years of the Trump administration. There may be a bit of a change in articulation, but I think the point of U.S.-China strategic competition is not going away. And I think the second issue would be, and I think we've highlighted this through a lot of the different points, is that a lot of the regional tensions in the region, whether they're from a maritime perspective, whether they're from foreign interference, whether they're trade issues, those also are not necessarily going away quickly. So that leads us, I think, to the point which I think both of you have highlighted numerous times today, is the need for Canada and Japan to kind of codify their cooperation. And whether it's David, I know that you champion the idea of an alliance. I think that's in many ways has a lot of merits. But definitely, I think there's merit in a free and open Indo-Pacific approach that Canada can put forward, and Japan being a strong pillar and one of the most important pillars and partners in that approach. So I thank you both for bearing with some of the technical difficulties. I don't think any of us are millennials on this call, so I'm also getting used to the webinar technology. But it was a great discussion nonetheless, and I thank the ambassador, and I thank David, and I thank all the viewers for tuning in. So thank you very much.
Thank you very
much, Jonathan.